Gerald McHenry is the Canada country representative on the Dispute Resolution Board Foundation and a member of the board of directors. Civil engineer, master's degree in geotechnical engineering, and senior consultant with Rive and Associates. And he's been working in all areas of construction, dispute resolution, including negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and litigation for 27 years. And John Davies is an Ontario licensed architect, Alberta registered architect, and a chartered arbitrator. And he's an affiliate member of the Ontario Bar Association, ADR and construction section. Over 20 years, he's served on and chaired many dispute boards, including some relating to the Hibernia oil development in Newfoundland and the Library of Parliament restoration project in Ottawa. And he currently serves as the chair of a 3-person dispute resolution board for the Toronto-York subway extension project, which is a huge project in Toronto, where I'm from, and Project Neutral for another $500 million component of the Toronto Union Station restoration project. So they both have tremendous amount of expertise with dispute resolution boards, and look forward to hearing from both of them. Gentlemen.
Thank you. Okay. Well, good morning, and thank you for attending this conference. We wanted to introduce DRBs to the ADRIC because we realize that there's a need to inform people about the use of DRBs in Canada. It's a concept that some of you may not be entirely familiar with, and hopefully at the end of this conference you'll have a better appreciation of it. The last time I was in Calgary was just at the end of May. I came in to run the marathon here. I'm hoping that this experience will be a little bit less grueling for both of us. Okay, so DRBs. Thought I'd give you just a brief introduction as to what we will be discussing. First, a few words about the Dispute Resolution Board Foundation that I'm a representative of. Then we'll discuss DRBs quickly. What are they? Who's using them and where? I'll give you some U.S. and Canadian examples, and we'll talk about the costs, the benefits, and the resolution rate. Okay. So the DRBF is an international association of construction professionals. Was formed in 1996 to promote the use of DRBs, and it resulted from the first DRB took place about 40 years ago in a tunnel in Colorado. And this year at our annual conference, we celebrated that event. So there's over 900 members throughout the world, 60 countries, about 400 of these in North America, and it's a non-profit organization. Everybody's a volunteer trying to promote a better way to resolve disputes in the construction industry. The objectives is one of education, offering training for the people attending, for the users and the members, and we also publish a practices and procedures manual that I brought a copy of. So what is a DRB? We like to think of it as a common sense, real-time approach to issue resolution. And it's the construction industry's alternative to arbitration and litigation. Why do I call it common sense? Because it's a panel of basically 3 wise men that are very experienced in the type of work for which the project is concerned with. Usually a lot of heavy infrastructure projects for bridges, roads, hydroelectric projects. The members of the board are respected by their peers. They're approved by both parties, and they're chosen because they're known to be objective, neutral, impartial in their approach. Also, these members should have no conflict of interest and even any perceived conflict of interest. So we sign a three-party agreement, much like an arbitration convention, that obligates each member to serve both parties. And although they may have been nominated by one party, that nomination is quickly forgotten, so that they work to be independent and objective in their analysis. And we also have a code of ethics that's followed. Why do I say it's a real-time approach? Because the objective is to review and resolve the disputes as they arrive and not wait to the end. So before you see that typical timing with a construction dispute is that during the construction the contractor encounters a problem. He gives a notice to the owner that there is a problem, that he's going to be making a claim. Often that claim is not submitted until the end of the job, and then it might take several months and years before it's resolved through mediation, or arbitration, or litigation. The idea with the DRB is that we try and resolve it during the actual construction period. And how is that done? With the main concept is dispute avoidance, regular meetings during the course of the project, and then we have two options in terms of hearings: either a simple advisory opinion that can be very short, that takes place during a regular meeting, or we can have a much more formal hearing with a written recommendation. So all of it is the idea is to resolve it during the construction. So here we compare the two, and you can see that from the dispute resolution point of view, it's much faster with the DRB, and that's the principal objective. Okay. So again, what is the DRB? So panel selected after the contract award and even before the construction begins, before any disputes actually take place. So who are the members of the board? Generally, it's engineers with a lot of experience. Sometimes the lawyers are the chairman. And in the past, DRBs were developed because the parties wanted to keep the lawyers out of the discussion from making it overcomplicated. But now, in the last 10, 20 years, there are many lawyers that have a lot of experience in construction, and they serve very well as chairman of the DRBs. So what is the best practice? How does somebody get nominated? Well, generally, from what we've seen, the best practice is to have a roster of approved candidates that both parties can pick from. So that would be typically an owner would, over the years, develop a list of people that they know and respect, that have been working in the industry, whether it be bridges or whether it be for hydroelectric projects, whatever. And they have this list that both parties can pick from. And that doesn't mean that the names are cast in concrete. If a new contractor is nominated, he can actually suggest other names to be added to the list. That's the best practice, but the most common practice is what we see often for arbitration, where each party nominates one DRB member, and the parties approve and reject each other's nominee. That's something that's a little bit different. Both parties have the right to refuse any other nomination by the other party. So it's a mutual agreement of the parties. Okay. So the DRB is provided with the contract documents and becomes familiar with the project and participants, monthly updates. They basically stay up to date with everything that's happening during the project. One of the key aspects of the DRB is that they meet on the site at regular intervals, 1 to 3 months, and participate at regular owner meetings. This is where the dispute avoidance aspect comes in, because the DRB, because of their experience, they try to encourage discussion, cooperation, and proactive avoidance of the disputes during these meetings. It's probably one of the most important aspects of a DRB is that it's very informal. We try and sit down with the parties and we ask them what's keeping them up at night, preventing them from sleeping, what are the problems, and we try and project down the line where we think some of these problems might be going and how we're going to try and prevent the disputes. Okay? So proactive dispute avoidance, the DRB is stays up to date with the correspondence, minutes of meetings. Before coming to the meetings, the DRB is aware of the problems. They're going to be asking probing questions based on their experience to the panel to identify potential or real problems. And we're going to monitor the evolution of these issues with respect to notices for claims, for potential delays, things of this nature, and ask the parties, what are you doing about it to resolve these disputes as the project goes on. Okay? So it's not a question of waiting to the end of the job. It's identifying the problems and taking much like a risk management approach to these problems to try and prevent them from becoming more serious problems. And despite the dispute avoidance aspect, there's also some problems can't be resolved just quickly through cooperation between the parties. So disputes arrive, and there's two approaches to resolving those. One, in the case of a simple dispute, the parties can make a presentation to the DRB in an informal way, maybe just 1 hour on each side, explain the problem to the DRB, and then we'll listen to that, ask questions that we have to, and then caucus, come back after an hour, and make a recommendation to the parties how to resolve that issue. That's good for simple disputes. Sometimes in construction, the disputes can become quite complex, and it's necessary to go to a more formal hearing with a written recommendation. So the parties will prepare a list of issues. They will submit position papers, both at the same time. They'll both submit rebuttals, and then there'll be a hearing. We call it a formal hearing, but it's a lot more informal than an arbitration might be. The simple procedures, there's no discovery beforehand. There may be expert witnesses, but there's no cross-examination. There's no active participation by the lawyers. Actually, it's the DRB members that are asking the questions in order to properly understand the position of both parties. Then after that, we'll write a recommendation. So the recommendation is generally, it's written, and a particular aspect of DRBs is that generally it concerns just the entitlement. The quantum is a much more difficult issue for both sides to prepare. It takes a lot of time. Sometimes nobody knows really what the quantum is going to be at the time the problem arrives, so it's left to the end. So it's the recommendation is based on entitlement, and basically we just turn it back to the parties and we say, okay, one of you is right, one of you is wrong. You have to go back and work out the cost between you. Often the recommendation is non-binding, and you might ask, well, what is the benefit of that? It's because it becomes a much more flexible process. The lawyers for the owners and for the contractors generally prefer that it be a non-binding type of recommendation. It gives the parties more flexibility in terms of how to deal with it. One of the kickers with the DRB process is that the recommendation should be admissible as evidence later in arbitration or litigation. So you have this experienced body of panel of 3 people known to be independent. They were approved by both parties. They lived the project. They listened to the parties in their formal presentations, and they made a recommendation. So you can imagine that if a judge would find out that this DRB existed and the experience of the parties, and they made a written recommendation, he's going to be very interested in getting a hold of that because he may not have the same experience himself in tunnels, in hydroelectric projects. So he's going to want to know how these very experienced people saw the case and made a recommendation on that. And one thing also that we should remember is that all the recommendations must adhere to the contract. So the DRBs do not rewrite the provisions of the contract, no matter how tough or unfair. So there should not be any question of natural justice or equity. The DRB should not impose their interpretation of what might be fair to the contractor. It's all within the four corners of the contract. Okay? So how do DRBs fit with the other dispute resolution processes? Perhaps the easiest way is if I just show you this little graph. And you can see I've indicated here this dispute resolution continuum where we have on the left axis an indication of where the parties are in more control, where the parties are in less control, and the actual cost. Low cost resolutions to the left, high cost resolutions to the right. And we can see that the dispute avoidance aspect of DRBs falls in there right after negotiation, partnering, and facilitation. And then when we get to the point where there's actually a decision that has to be made, the DRB process would follow in the same domain as early neutral evaluation, joint experts, and a little bit before mediation or a mini trial. Far away from the red zone would be the arbitration and litigation. So what type of projects are using DRBs? Well, very complex projects that have high cost, lengthy duration, where there's a risk of a delay, cost overruns, risk of litigation. So a lot of big infrastructure projects, highway, bridges, power plants, things of this nature. Okay. Typically for construction projects over $10 million, but there's a need for a single person DRBs, which we call a dispute resolution advisor for smaller projects that are in the range of $3 to $10 million. And my understanding is that if you wanted copies of these slides, that they're all available on the website. So any of these notes that you see here, you'll be able to get your own copy of it. Okay? So who's using them and where? DRBs are very popular in the U.S. There's been over 2,000 projects since 1986. On average, there's about 100 projects per year that have them. In Canada, the situation is quite different. I did a bit of research, and before 2010, there was about 12 different cases over a period of about 14 years, and most of those were DRBs were used by the Toronto Transit Commission on some of their subway projects. But over the last 2 years, there's been a real upsurge in the use of the DRBs. I like to think that's part of our efforts to try and promote the use of DRBs. And right now there's 14 to 15 cases going on. It says 14 here, but the numbers add up to 15 on the bottom. Most of the hotbed of the activity is in Toronto with 10, Vancouver with 2, and Quebec has got 3 sitting DRBs right now. I'll very briefly just give you an idea of what's happening in the U.S. There's a lot of use of DRBs for different departments of transportation. California, Colorado, Washington, you name it, they're all using DRBs for their highway projects. This gives you a good idea. Florida is has been using DRBs and swears by them for the last 20 years. But also Washington State, California, Massachusetts, they're very popular. Okay. I'll just speak about Florida. So there's a DRB on every project for $10 million. There's 20 to 30 DRBs per year. And the rate of success is about 95%. The state of Florida is very public about the use of the DRBs, and all the information is on a public website where you could go, you can download the procedures, you could download the roster of candidates, you can even download all the different recommendations that are made by the parties. So very public, there's nothing hidden here. So if a contractor gets extra money, then there's a reason behind it. All of this is done to make these recommendations in the public domain, so that there's no question of collusion or cooperation with the contractors. Okay. The types of disputes being heard. A lot of disputes concern different soil conditions, contract interpretation, design errors, and interpretations with regard to pay items. Delays are a big issue also. I have a few different testimonials. This is the Florida Department of Transportation. The Office of the Inspector General indicated that the DRB's process is leading to projects finishing more timely and having a reduced cost overruns and avoidance of claims. Massachusetts, another testimonial. The DRBs were used on the Big Dig project in Boston. So they say it's a practical, reliable, cost-effective procedure. Has a track record of resolving issues at a very early stage. It should be shared with other state departments of transportation. Here's just the results of some research done in Florida that says projects with DRBs have small savings in cost overruns and savings actually in time overruns. And that's because the DRB is there to keep the project on the road, resolve the problems, trying to avoid delays and get the job done. This is an example of how the number of arbitration cases have dropped in Florida since the use of the DRBs. Actually, it's good news for dispute resolution, maybe bad news for the lawyers that were working for the state of Florida on arbitrations. The same thing, I went to a conference just in San Francisco just a few weeks ago. The State Department of Washington had similar graphs in terms of the reduction in arbitrations due to the use of DRBs. Okay. I'll give you an example that it's different cities in the U.S. Are also using DRBs. New York City, San Francisco, Miami, a lot for big transportation projects in their cities. Notably, New York has been using them on huge projects. East Side Access, $7 billion. There are 7 contracts with DRBs. Second Avenue Subway, 2 contracts, $4.5 billion. And so on, big projects there. One project that I had a chance to work on, not sitting on the DRB, but as an expert, was 2 tunnels that were going from Long Island Railroad underneath the river and onto the Grand Central Station, where there are these tunnels and huge caverns that were excavated into the rock beneath Grand Central Station. And there was very important problems encountered on these particular projects. In this particular case, it was a limitation for blasting. That because of Grand Central Station was just about 90 feet above where these caverns are going on. So the contractor had a $100 million claim with respect to the additional time and cost it took him to excavate these tunnels. The DRB was sitting on that project for many years and was able to resolve these disputes with other parties so that it didn't go to litigation. Okay. Here's just another testimonial from the WMATA, which is the Washington Metro Transportation Authority, that believes the presence of the board encourages both owners and contractor to settle their differences, in most instances even before the DRB hearings. Okay. So the board has proved beneficial in minimizing the adversarial relationships of the parties and useful in guiding resolutions to issues prior to them becoming a dispute. So I've shown you a lot of what we call horizontal construction projects, roadways, tunnels, things like this, but DRBs are also being used for what we call vertical construction, for conference centers. The University of Washington has been using them for the last 15 years and swears by them on all their projects, whether it be research centers, conference centers, new engineering buildings, whatever. Another testimonial from there saying that they've integrated DRBs into collaborative project teams for prevention of disputes. So University of Washington has had no litigation over the past 10 years and no formal disputes or claims. Again, there's this collaborative, cooperative approach that the DRBs try to instill in the projects. So I'm just looking, not so bad. Now, maybe enough about the projects in the U.S. Let's look at what's happening in Canada. And I mentioned to you before, there's projects ongoing in Vancouver and some past and present projects in Niagara, Toronto, Fredericton, and in Hydro-Quebec. Could you just pour me some water? Sure. Okay. Let's take a look at Vancouver. There's the Port Mann Bridge and Highway was a project with DRBs. There's also at Port Mann, there's another tunnel going underneath the river that has a DRB sitting on it right now. There's also in the Vancouver area, there's a big water tunnel between Seymour and Capilano that had a DRB on it that was resolving problems with respect to rock conditions. Okay. I had the chance to work on a big tunnel in the Niagara area. It was a 10-kilometer long tunnel that took the water from above the falls to power station below 10 kilometers below the falls. On this particular project, 25% of the way into the project, the contractor encountered severe change conditions with respect to the rock. The contractor was facing huge delays. He estimated to be 2 years. Cost overruns in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Liquidated damages of $250,000 per day. If the problems weren't resolved, the contractor was going to either leave the project or be terminated by the owner. The DRB was able to intervene at an early stage, 25% of the project advancement, and make a recommendation to the parties that the change conditions are real, it's not made up, and that additional compensation is due to the contractor. And at the suggestions of the DRB, the project value, the contract value, changed from $900 million to $1.6 billion on this project, and they finished late, 2 years late, but they finished the project. Had the contractor been terminated, then we would have faced years of litigation, and the cost would have easily doubled what actually happened. And that's because a new contractor coming in would have bid much higher to finish the work. So the DRB was very successful on this job. And an important aspect of the DRB's role in this particular case, they provided an independent third-party recommendation that served as a political cover to the government. in this particular instance, because when the project got announced, the government said that it would be finished on time at no extra cost to the taxpayer, and it wasn't the case. But they were able to point to the DRB as being independent and a panel of wise men making this recommendation so that everybody agreed that additional compensation is due, and it was settled without litigation. Okay? So TTC in Toronto, in the past they used the DRBs 1996 to 2002 for one of their subways extensions, and I think that was in the past, but I'll bring up some more slides in a minute about how they're using it today. Also in New Brunswick, it was used on some big highway projects. Two big projects that were actually P3 projects, public-private partnerships. Okay, I think I'll skip through that one. Okay, dealing right now in the TTC, there's approximately 5 DRBs sitting on the Toronto-York Spadina extension project. 2 tunnel sections, 4 stations. I'm sitting on one of these DRBs, and John is sitting on 2 of the DRBs, and he'll elaborate his experience on these projects just after me. Okay, they're 2 tunnels, and these are just to give you an idea of some of the stations. Architecturally, they're quite complex, and that's why John was chosen to sit on our panel of experts, which we try to mix up the expertise. Some people might have expertise in geotechnical aspects, others in planning and scheduling. John was important on our project because he's got architectural experience. So these are huge projects, deep excavations. That there can be a lot of problems with regard to utilities being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Also problems with changed soil conditions. These are the issues that are put before us as members of the DRB. Okay. You may have heard of this big LRT project in Toronto. It has 2 tunnel sections, and then I think 25 different stations. The tunnel sections had DRBs, and I'm not sure what's happening right now with the station project. That's a contract that was just let for $3 billion. It's also being DRBs were used on a sewer tunnel in the region of York, and a big water feeder main in the Hanlon region of Peel in Toronto. In Quebec, Hydro-Quebec is using DRBs on this Romaine River project, where they have 3 different sites of new powerhouses being built. And the DRBs are sitting on the concreting of the powerhouse. So deep excavations, a lot of concrete that go in there, and the DRBs have been successful to date, anyhow, in keeping these projects out of litigation. So let me just quickly I think wrap up some general conclusions about DRBs. The track record of success is very high. The resolution rate, according to the DRBF, is over 98%. What does that mean? This means that on projects with DRBs, how many disputes did not go on to arbitration or litigation that get solved? Okay. That's success is due to dispute avoidance and the popularity of the acceptance rates of the different recommendations. So why do they work? They promote open communication, trust and cooperation. They focus on early identification of the problems. They minimize the posturing, and neither party wants to suffer the loss of credibility by submitting claims with no merit. In fact, on over 60% of the projects with DRBs, the parties do not even submit a dispute to the DRB because they know that they have an experienced panel in front of them, and if there's any fluff or claims that have no merit, they're going to be quickly rejected. So they're very careful as to what gets submitted. There's a mutual desire to stay out of court. It's an impartial third-party evaluation by experienced people. And sometimes, not all the recommendations are actually accepted by the parties. They can be rejected, but more often than not, the recommendation serves as a basis for a final negotiation between the parties to resolve the dispute. So when the DRBs don't work, well, in some cases, for instance, part of the Big Dig work in California, there's some very complex procedural rules as to when a dispute can come before the DRB, meaning that first of all it gets reviewed at a low level, the project level, then there's a second level of administration that reviews it, then it goes to the head office, and you get the legal department that reviews it, and then it can go on and on several different levels, and it just takes forever before it becomes considered a dispute, at which point it can be presented to the DRB. So that lengthens the process, and DRBs have more difficulty in working on those projects because the problem never comes to them. There can also be, if the parties lose confidence in certain members of the DRB because of perception of partiality, then the DRB might not work. And that's why it's so important for the members of the DRB to alleviate any misunderstandings with regard to being partial. So we try to avoid any ex parte communications. The only communication goes through the chairman. The other members don't talk to the parties. Even the party that nominated that member, there should be no further communication during the course of the project with that DRB member. And then sometimes a board member or chairman might just be too busy or not qualified for the nature of the dispute. This has happened before in the past. On one of the DRBs for the Toronto subway project, the chairman of the panel was just too busy. Very unfortunate. He was involved in the Panama Canal project. It just occupied all his time. He wasn't able to devote much time to the Toronto subway project, and it fell apart. He wasn't responding to emails. He wasn't writing his recommendations, and the parties lost confidence in the DRB, and they disbanded it. So that's a case where that happens. So I think it's up to the DRB panel members not to take on too much work. Okay, so how do we avoid these particular problems? Simplify the procedures to get to the board, and we need to choose the board members carefully. I know everybody's interested in what are the costs of the DRBs. I've done some simple calculations for you. On average, we could say engineers go for about $250 an hour. The lawyers could be much higher than that, I realize that. But let's say there's 3 members of the panels. For 1 day visit on the site, it's about $6,000 per day for a meeting. That's every 3 months. To this, we might have to add travel time, expenses. Each case is a little bit different, and there's time to prepare. So let's say that it's about $10,000 per periodic meeting for 3 months. So we're talking about maybe $40,000 a year just for the meetings. If there's a formal hearing, then it depends on the number of days that will take place during the hearing and how much time will be necessary to write up the report. But just to give you an idea, overall the direct cost ranges from about 0.1 to 0.5% of the final construction cost. Really very little compared with the litigation cost. Okay. Just give you an idea, last month Washington State gave an idea about their DRB statistics. Over 2 years they had 28 boards. The members' rates are approximately $200 an hour. Total value of the projects was, average of $64 million per job. The average cost of the DRB was $130,000, so 0.2% of the project value. Benefits, I think I've gone through these before. Resolution of the issues at job site level, fewer end-of-project claims, reduces job delay due to disputes, reduces contract completion cost, minimize arbitration. Other perceived benefits increase the number of bidders who are reassured by more timely resolution of disputes, more competitive bids, and political cover because it's a recommendation by independent board. And for this second aspect about more competitive bids, this has been confirmed to me by several contractors when they're doing their risk management matrix on certain jobs. If there's a DRB, there's an item that goes in there that says that they're going to reduce their contingency for problems by a certain percentage because they know the DRB is on the job and they have a better chance of resolving their disputes without going to litigation. Okay? So from my point of view, the DRB process works and it works well, simple, flexible, objective, neutral recommendations, very successful. And if you want more information, I have on the slide how you can contact the DRBF. And also, for those of you that are interested, I brought with me just a one-page flyer from the DRBF that describes the procedure, and also a copy of an article that I wrote a few years ago about the use of DRBs in Canada, where I describe in a little bit more detail some of these particular projects in Canada where DRBs were used. So now I'll pass the floor to John.
Thank you, Gerald. My experience basically on DRBs, I'll talk about two that have been involved in Toronto. The first one was one of the stations on the new subway system, and that started off in an incredibly hostile mood. People were at each other's throats over the boardroom table, and they were ready to do battle. The first meeting we had basically was we managed to soothe all of the characters into being intelligent about the problems that arose. We went every 3 months to our meeting. We reviewed the site. We looked at all of the trigger issues, things like the number of requests for information, the number of change orders, the evaluation of shop drawings and the processes and all of these things, and identified where the problems were and where the streamlining could take place to expedite the work. We attended probably 3 years of meetings, and over the course of the 3 years, the project settled down to such a degree that the last one that I went to, they decided to stand the DRB down because they were getting close to the end of it and they could see no further major issues that needed to be brought before the DRB. The second one started off quite congenially, and one of the problems was that they were using an offshore company to build it who was unfamiliar with a lot of the processes that we in North America use during heavy construction. This started to extend the progress of the project to such a degree that the animosity started. On that particular project, we've had 5 formal hearings and 1 informal hearing. The product of our presentation on all 6 of the issues have now been accepted by the parties, and they're in a negotiation phase to solve the financial side of it. We only, in that particular case, dealt with the merit of the claims, not the quantum. And one of the reasons is the project is still under construction, and you can't really negotiate a reasonable settlement to Quantum until all of the issues are in and being looked at collectively over the entire cost of the project. So those are my experiences with two DRBs in this country. Internationally, I've had some experience with DABs, which are adjudication boards. Now, one of the things that's happening internationally in construction is that a lot of the countries are having special legislation passed with regard to solving construction-related problems. The UK was probably the first to do this and has the most successful success with the enaction of these requirements. Similarly, in Australia and New Zealand, they have this adjudication legislation, but in most instances that's more to do with the expedited payment of invoicing by subtrades and this sort of thing, for which they don't have lien acts like we do in North America, and so consequently they introduced adjudication as a method of expediting payments that would normally go through lien legislation in Canada and the US. The international contracts, the FIDIC series of contracts, have a very similar process to dispute resolution boards known as dispute adjudication boards. And I set one of those up in Rome for a project that I was working on in Rome quite recently, and it was very successful. The project had an awful lot of problems and was eventually terminated for no fault of either of the parties. And very simply, it was on a huge, they put the shovel in the ground and they found a huge Roman mansion dating back 2,500 years, and so the authorities came in and force majeured the whole project and said, I'm sorry, you can't build your building on our mansion. But that was very successful in resolving, after the dissolution of the project, all of the issues and the degree to which each party had participated. Getting the hook here, so. Extra time started later. Okay, well, I'll keep talking. I've got lots of experience in these things. So, and I was wondering that one of the things, of course, is we've done an awful lot of talking here, and it's a relatively new concept to many of you in this room, and I was wondering if any of you had any concerns or questions that we haven't made clear. And yes, sir, that gentleman at the back.
First of all, I need to thank Gerald for introducing me to this system in June.
Yes.
And for urging me to go to the San Francisco training. And so that really is one question is what do the people in this room need to do to get the training? If that's anybody in this room that feels that they want to pursue this as an option for their own use. And I had a specific question for you, John.
Yes.
Often our formal contracts have the architect of record in the first instance being the interpreter of the contract.
Yes.
So when you talk about DRB setup, how do you bring in the architect of record?
Well, to answer your first question, I'll let Gerald answer the training component. Yeah. The architect or engineer of record is the arbiter in the first instance. And until that person has ruled under the terms of the contract, we really don't have any position to play. Once he's ruled, then you're into an incipient dispute. Once it becomes a dispute, then the boards take over with regard to resolving the dispute. And in many instances, the problem, for example, with an architect of record or an engineer of record is that they are there, but they prepared the drawings. And in many instances, the drawings may have been contributory to the cause of the dispute in the first place. So they basically have a conflict of interest, even though they have a contractual duty to be impartial. The beauty of the board, of course, is that it's impartial. And you get an impartial evaluation of the engineering or architectural issues that are really essential to each of the success of each of the parties' positions without this sort of cloud of prejudice or bias or that sort of thing. So that's where I found we're very helpful under those circumstances. Gerald, you want a quick chat on training?
Yeah, the DRBF offers training every year at its annual conferences. It's relatively simple training, especially compared to that of an arbitrator. It's half-day sessions. One is an introduction, and the second session is how to chair DRB. For you people, it would be relatively simple. The important aspects that are different concerns some of the procedures, the philosophy behind dispute avoidance, and also the ethics are important. But also the DRBF is very open to provide in-house training for an entity, for instance, an owner that might be going down the road of using DRBs on their projects. And that's what we did with Hydro-Quebec. They decided to use, for the first DRB, that we assembled in the same room 5 or 6 representatives from the contractor, 5 or 6 representatives from the owner, and we had the actual DRB panel who were sitting in the same room. Everybody took the same training so that everybody was on the same page with respect to how things were going to operate and what to expect out of the DRB. So that's another option for the training. Okay. The difficulty after that is how to get named to a board. First of all, it depends on the frequency as to how many DRBs are being used. In Canada, we're trying to promote the process. Say, for instance, if the Department of Transportation here in Alberta were to decide to go that route, then it would be important to develop DRB members in the local area so the DRBF could come in and make a public introduction to DRBs and train the people necessary for these projects. Hopefully that answers the question.
So one of the other things too is that DRBs in general are non-binding and are advisory in their nature. But that doesn't prevent the parties, when they feel they have a real problem, to request it to be binding before the hearing, in which case we would prepare a report and make it binding. The difference in the DABs, the international ones, is that they are binding in the interim, subject to a period of time, but it's 30, 60, 85 days or whatever it is. And during that period, the one or other or both of the parties can appeal the finding and either have it revisited or set it aside to arbitration or mediation or litigation at the end of the project. So there's a slight variation between the two systems, but all in all, there's a sort of a general, for example, I was an expert determinator on, pardon, my best wishes to Arnold there. The idea being that I was given totally free rein, ex parte ability to speak to the parties, and on that particular project I could go through the files myself as an expert and reevaluate how one came to this particular problem and offer a determination which was non-binding, but they felt would cut down an awful lot of the problems associated with going through a litigation process to resolve it. So I think I'm out of time, and I think I want to thank you all for coming here and listening to us. And if we're going to be around for the rest of the day, and so come and see us, seek us out, and we can have a one-on-one about your particular concerns with regard to dispute resolution. Thank you, gentlemen, ladies.